Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast in the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. This September, our organisation is marking 40 years at the forefront of investigating and campaigning against environmental crime and abuse. From the early days as pioneers of working undercover, we've come a long way in 4 decades. And as part of our celebrations, this podcast has been talking with some of our longest-serving campaigners about the work they've done and the changes they've seen. I'm Paul Newman, EIA Senior Press and Communications Officer, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Debbie Banks, a globally respected figure in tiger conservation and, fortunately for us, the leader of EIA UK's Tigers and Wildlife Crime campaign. Debbie, welcome, and thanks very much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Good afternoon, and it's lovely to be here.
Been about time. We've been trying to get you on the podcast for ages, but you're always so busy. To start with, perhaps you could give us a bit about your background. What were you doing before you found your way to EIA?
Before I joined EIA, I was finishing my studies. I studied zoology as an undergraduate degree, and then I did my master's in conservation at University College London, and I had raised some money myself and took off to India to meet with a whole bunch of people involved in tiger conservation to get a sense of the realities beyond what I could read in papers and books and watch on film. And so that was my first foray into, I guess, the politics of conservation. And that's where I was just before I joined EIA.
So you were evidently passionate about tigers before you got to us. It was more like you brought your passion to us and you came to us and then found something you really liked.
Yeah, I've been super lucky. And also, as I say, going out there of my own volition and meeting people from all different backgrounds involved in tiger conservation in India really set my mind to what I wanted to do. And that had been prompted, as I say, during my master's degree. We had a lecture from renowned tiger naturalist and behaviouralist Valmik Thapar. He gave a lecture at London Zoo, and I was just really, really inspired and determined after that to do what I could to contribute to tiger conservation.
Thankfully, you found your way to us. When and how did you actually join EIA? And I guess what were your first impressions of the organisation at the time you joined?
I'd first heard of EIA through their film work. So the film Let Them Live and the Animal Detective series. And as well through one of my good friends who was on the master's course with me, Craig Bennett, who's now chief executive at the Wildlife Trusts. And he had started working on EIA's bear campaign. And there was EIA's founding director, Dave Curry, at that time was doing some research and developing the report that would ultimately launch EIA's tiger campaign. So this is way back in 1996. And so I got some voluntary work doing remote research to support the development of that report. And then about a month before the launch of EIA's tiger campaign, I was interviewed for the role of a volunteer assistant to Dave Curry down in London. And that was fairly typical in those days, across much of the wider environmental movement that was made up of a lot of people who, were working odd jobs and saving money so that they could volunteer. But as I say, I was very lucky. I got, for me, what was a dream role, even as a volunteer. And within about a month of joining EIA, I was back in India organising press conferences and meetings with Dave to share the findings of our political wilderness report. And that was an amazing opportunity to travel the country, meet amazing people in the front line of conservation, from government to NGOs, villagers to media, including many of the people that I'd met during my own personal trip. And being in the midst of that, all those great minds strategizing and challenging at that time the very high level indifference to wildlife and the environment, as was the case at the time in India. It put me in a real steep learning curve. So it was a great opportunity, and I'm grateful.
Yeah, it must have been fascinating. It's almost like a crash course in how to do campaigning based around a single output, because you get to see the whole panoply of it, don't you? You get the political side of it, the research side of it, the people who are affected by it. I guess that must have been quite a good grounding for what you got on to do with us.
Yeah, I mean, the EIA was in those days a much smaller organisation, and we all had to do a bit of everything from the filming and investigations to the media engagement, campaigning, advocacy with policymakers, all the admin and the fundraising that goes with that. So, and as a small organisation, EIA is really gutsy and edgy and delivering hard-hitting exposés, delivering the truth to the wider conservation community and to policymakers. So yeah, being able to be a part of that entire process was really, was really eye-opening.
I gather as well as all the, if you like, the administrative side of things you've been doing in the field, you've also gone into the field as both an investigator and a person on point, helping to lead a team out there. What was that like going into the field for the very first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think although our name says Environmental Investigation Agency, a lot of what we do is we're not necessarily investigating environmental crime, as you mentioned. A lot of what we're looking at is wider abuse of the natural world, looking at governance issues. And my first field work, if you like, for EIA was to visit Kaziranga National Park in Assam in northeast India with a retired forest officer who was a wonderful human being, an advisor to EIA, Mr. Sanjay Debroy. And I was actually, traveling with him to oversee, purchase of equipment like an ambulance and a boat to support staff and communities impacted by flooding in Kaziranga National Park. And, we were interviewing people and documenting the harsh reality of what happens when government funding doesn't flow the way it should to critical areas like Kaziranga, and the impact that has on the people living around the park, but also the forest officers and forest guards themselves. So that was my first field work, but which so wasn't really investigative, but more about documenting the impact of that poor governance at the time. My, I guess, first field trip as part of an investigation was with a consultant investigator who has Chinese language skills to document the availability of medicines that are labelled as containing tiger in European cities. And this was to support our campaign calling for amendments to CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, to amend recommendations around national legislation globally to prohibit trade in parts and products that are marketed as or labelled as or claim in any other way to contain a protected species like the tiger. So these investigations were to help law enforcement so that they could seize those kind of products, the tiger bone pills, tiger bone wine, without having to forensically prove it contained tiger before confiscating it. So, yeah, it was a very direct link between the field work that we were doing and the sort of campaign outputs and asks that we had.
So, if you don't mind the aside, obviously, could you give us a bit of context as to the sort of the situation where this work was taking place? What was the state of tiger conservation, tiger populations around the world at the time when you first joined EIA and began working with us?
Well, in 1996, the international community had a bit of a finger in the air estimate that there were between 4,000 to 7,000 wild tigers left, although that was, factored down following the emergence of what was to be considered the tiger crisis in India. And then, by the end of towards the year 2000, there was a lot of speculation as to whether tigers would even survive into this century. Fortunately, they have. Unfortunately, science has improved radically, and we're not finger in the air quite so much now. And today's population estimate is around 5,500 wild tigers remaining globally. And as it was in the 90s, it's the same case today, that India is home to the majority of those wild tigers, over 70%. So, India really is a major stronghold for the survival of the species.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to get it right there as much as anywhere else, because that's where most of them are, isn't it?
Yes, one of the reasons that EIA's sort of first major report, Political Wilderness, focused on India was because at that time, in 1996, there was a little bit of a state of denial, you could say, around the crisis facing the tigers. The National Board for Wildlife, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, hadn't met for many years. The official statistics crossing the desk of the former director of Project Tiger at the time suggested there were very few poaching and trade incidents, and yet it was massive independent reporting coming from across the country of poaching and other threats to wild tigers that led experts in India to declare that one tiger a day was being lost from the population. So we were really coming in from the, it would appear that we were coming in from the outside to criticise the then government, but we were very much connected to conservationists, as I say, from all different parts of society, people involved in tiger conservation, listening to them and playing the role that EIA is so expert at, which is in some instances playing the bad cop and saying what needs to be said to catalyse some action. And that's what we were doing with that report, Political Wilderness.
And obviously you've been in tiger range states often, I guess, in the last few decades. What are your most vivid memories of working with EIA, the ones that really stick in your mind as key moments?
I would say that amongst my most vivid of memories and experiences was the work that we were doing with our colleagues, the Wildlife Protection Society of India in Tibet. This was around 2004 all the way through for about 8 years. We were working in that area, but at the beginning, the situation was we were seeing huge seizures, massive consignments of tiger, leopard, and other wildlife being seized, moving across what we call the Trans-Himalayan border trade network between India, Nepal, Tibet, China. Hundreds of skins. And we followed the trail together with WPSI. They were working from the India through Nepal end of it, and we were working our way back through from the consumer end, China to Tibet. So doing that work and uncovering the sheer scale of the trade in tiger and leopard skins and the use of those skins up until 2006, the use of those skins to decorate traditional Tibetan costumes. That was like a major piece of work, and it was both heartbreaking to see firsthand the sheer scale of that, but also understanding that the people who were wearing those skins and buying those skins didn't know that it was illegal, didn't know that tigers were threatened with extinction, didn't know that the animals were being killed specifically for their skins to cater for that demand. And just having conversations with people and really seeing changes in their attitude was quite significant. But this was a long-term piece of work, and the outcome between 2004 and 2006 was sharing our findings with the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, sharing our video and photographs and our account of what we were seeing across the Tibetan Plateau, and then the Dalai Lama spoke out at a major event in India at the beginning of 2006, and within days we had reports from people that skins were being burned across the Tibetan plateau, and there's this massive change and significant change in demand, and a really massive decline subsequently in the use of skins to decorate traditional costumes. It's not down to zero, but huge decline, and that was a really sort of vivid time throughout our work. It was that sort of really sticks with me as of EIA being, at the front line of that.
Must have been incredibly satisfying having done all that field work and research to actually be able to get the ear of somebody like the Dalai Lama, whose voice then carries so much influence, like beyond, exclusives on broadcast news or front page headlines. Just one person's word can carry so much weight.
Yeah, it was it was not a moment that anyone or an outcome that we could have predicted. As I say, we passed the information on. We said, please make use of it as you see fit. And we could never have predicted what would happen. It's a hugely important and significant to see how getting the information to the right person at the right time can contribute to such a change. And I think that made up for, the sort of personal trauma or horror, if you like, at seeing so many tiger and leopard skins being used. And I think that was, as I say, it made up for some of those horrors.
Yeah, because obviously it must be an unpleasant reality of the trade is that you yourself know exactly what's used and where and how from these animals. So when you see X number of skins, you understand that used to be so many live tigers. That this amount of bone represents that many animals that are now gone. And obviously, if it's a finite pool to begin with, each one is a major blow, isn't it? Absolutely,
every tiger counts, and it was a sharp contrast to between how the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama responded to this, our findings, contrasted with, how unfortunately how the government of China responded, and there was a unintended consequences of our campaign was pressure on Tibetans who work for the Chinese government, to go out and buy new skins. It was very well documented at the time. But I don't regret the work that EIA and WPSI did on that. I think it was groundbreaking. And I think it was really true to what is unique about EIA and how we get down on the ground to document and see these things for ourselves, to interview and meet with different stakeholders who are on the front line and get their truth and their testimony. I think that was a piece of work that really reflected what's been EIA's legacy, really.
And what do you think have been some of the organisation's biggest successes in which you've been able to play a part on top of that? Not that I'm asking you to just sit there blowing your trumpet, but why not, as we got the moment?
I think sometimes our successes, they can be like the outcome we had with the skin trade work and the skin trade investigations we were doing. That's, in the Dalai Lama, and then the decisions at CITES, and general movement towards addressing the tiger and leopard skin trade. But I think sometimes away from those public reports and media exposés, if you like, are the longer term successes that come to fruition. I think about, for example, the way that we've helped raise the profile of organised criminality and corruption within environmental crime amongst a key group of stakeholders. So back in 2006, EIA was the only environmental organisation that was at the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime meeting in Vienna. And we gave an intervention on the indicators of organised crime that were prevalent in that trans-Himalayan big cat trade. And at that time, within the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which administers the UN Convention on Transnational Organised Crime, only their Southeast Asia programme was really looking at wildlife and especially forest crimes. So we kind of were breaking new ground there. And, 2 years on, we returned with our report and film, Our Planet, Our Problem, and launched a campaign to really mainstream environmental crime into the work of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. And so we really shone a spotlight on the role that a whole different body of stakeholders had to play in combating and countering environmental crime. And, we worked on from there. We initiated the development of indicators of effective enforcement, which sounds a little bit policy wonk, but it was really, when we're asking governments to do better, to be more effective in their enforcement against environmental crime, what does that look like? And, it's beyond seizures and arrests. It's about, proceeds of crime, following the money, the deployment of and use of specialised investigative techniques, etc. And so we started, mapping out what does that look like, and then we roped in the UN Office on Drugs and Crime to lead on that. And as I say, that's way back in the midst of time when we started doing that. And now the UNODC is central to countering environmental crime. They have huge programs funded to work on all kinds of environmental crimes, and there's many more NGOs now at the table looking at organised criminality and environmental crime. So we helped change the narrative around that and to bring in, I guess, the professional law enforcement community a lot more. So I think that doesn't sound like a very sexy change or success.
I don't know. To me, it sounds like you've actually been planting the seeds and nurturing them to get it taken seriously. I remember when I first started here volunteering in 2010, and a couple of campaigners opined that one of the problems with wildlife crime is that everyone thought, officially everyone, not everyone on the planet, but officialdom kind of regarded it as a victimless crime. It's like you're only killing animals. It's not like you're trafficking people. It's not like you're selling lethal drugs or weapons. It's like, well, actually, those are a part of it as well, but it's actually getting those agencies to accept that it is a major crime and it's worth looking at, because as people like yourself have subsequently found out, there's a lot of overlap. People that trade in one kind of international transnational crime stream will happily dip their toe in another as well. So I think, a pat on the back, because if you're getting major international enforcement organizations to pay attention and to treat it as the crime it is, then that's a major step forward, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very nice way of putting it. It was getting the right people in the right place and getting them around the table was the strategy, and to do that, we had to point out the greater harms, the social and economic harms, the harms to governance and the financing of other serious crime types as a result of environmental crime, but also that convergence in the networks of organised criminal networks that were dabbling in multiple different commodities. So it's been a success, I would say, in that respect.
Well, as you mentioned, you've been with us since sometime in the late 90s. I shan't nail it down for you specifically unless you want me to. But you must have seen the nature of environmental crime has changed a lot over that period, or has it? And how do you feel, if it has changed, EIA as an organisation has adapted to meet those changing challenges?
I think back in the 90s, EIA was already seeing how organised criminality was was part of the wildlife crime chain through our investigations into the ivory trade, for example, and crossing continents and the level of organisation there. And, in those days, perhaps more typical mafia style groups. And obviously it's changed a lot since then. A lot of the criminal networks that are more fluid and dynamic in how they operate. You have multiple, if you're a mid-level trader, you'll have multiple supplier chains, multiple buyer chains. So we understand it's not always like a syndicate or a familial mafia style organization. But certainly it's always, when we're looking at the transnational trade in wildlife, it's always been very organized. I think in the context of some of the wildlife work that we've done, or wildlife work that I've been involved in, we've gone from a situation where wildlife trade, the trade in tiger, leopard and other parts was taking place fairly openly in the sort of mid to late 90s, early 2000s, and at a time where we could talk to traders more openly about their businesses, to that trade going under the counter, which is not the same as going underground, so it's still accessible. But it meant that we needed to recruit more specialised investigators, particularly investigators with particular language skills. We had to start investing in more complex and long-term investigations into the business models and operations of these transnational networks involved. And to do that, we had to change how we're funded and try and secure more long-term funding. So we were not as hand to mouth as we used to be.
Because you can't play the long game when you're going hand to mouth.
I think in the early days, in the early days, in the 90s or so, we might do investigations that would last a couple of months. But it would be like following a lead from one place to the next. And, that would be it. You'd have like 2-3 months in the field to capture everything, and then, prepare for however that information was going to be used, whether it was going to law enforcement or more typically in those days, to expose what was happening under the very noses of law enforcement. Now we have to be, our investigations are more sophisticated. The criminal networks are more sophisticated. So you've got to try and match that, although they have a lot more resources than we do. And I think, I guess I would say, way back in 2004, when we were mapping by hand how some of these transnational criminal networks were working and, the different players and key figures within them, it was literally, bits of paper and photos pasted up on a wall with bits of string and drawing pins, so it really was in those days, quite basic how we did that. I started to look at how we could bring in more professional crime and intelligence analysis expertise into the organization, sort of recognizing that if we could present our findings in a format and a language that the professional intelligence community were familiar with, it was going to help us get our findings taken more seriously by that community and by professional law enforcement. So I brought in our first crime analyst in 2006 to work on our Tiger campaign and oversaw the growth of that team to a handful of people to work across wildlife. And that has now grown significantly and is now masterfully led by Melanie, our head of intelligence and investigations, into its own unit, a huge unit now working across all of EIA's campaigns. So I think that was another way in which we've tried to keep pace with the changing nature of environmental crime.
Yeah, I was just thinking, and you mentioned, the first intelligence officer we had, which would be the legendary Charlotte Davis,
yes,
was one person condensing all this information into incredibly complex and insane-looking charts about how 18 people are all related to each other and then related to another 30 people over there. I was like, how do you carry that in your head? And now, of course, you realise that we've now got, you say, more than 14, 15 people in the team. and obviously they're spread across the earth. So the whole nature of what we do is kind of the emphasis has changed to an extent in that, we're digging deeper into the intel and looking at how they're all connected to each other.
Yeah, and I think obviously another major change has been the use of social media and other online platforms as a place where illegal wildlife trade happens, and adapting to that, and that can generate huge volumes of information, social network analysis. And profiling of individuals that we have met and encountered in person involved in illegal wildlife trade, and then using social media to understand their relationships and uncovering as part of that much wider networks, which informs our investigations, it informs law enforcement, and all of that's being got to be processed by our intelligence and investigations unit. So to look into things at the level we're now looking at them has required a lot of investment in those skills and expertise.
You mentioned earlier on that we're small and nimble, so able to respond very effectively and quite quickly. What else have you think has been the secret of our success over the years, apart from just being able to play bad cop?
I think we're, as a campaigning organisation, first and foremost, our unique selling point is not so much that we do undercover investigations. Many people do undercover investigations into environmental crime. It's more that those investigations are just one tool in our work to ground truth what is happening, along with our networking, capturing testimony from civil society and government on the front line, our non-undercover investigations, and then carrying those messages to the decision makers. We're catalysts for change, and I think what separates us from policy think tanks or other organizations is that EIA campaigners do go to the field to capture this ourselves with our partner organizations, so that we can say we've been there, we've seen that, and we can stand up at in policy discourse and dialogue and conferences, etc. We can talk from a point of view where we've really ground truthed things ourselves. I think that's what is our unique selling point. And I would say, if I may, I think the other secret of our successes starts with our people. We're a bunch of committed, passionate, knowledgeable individuals who form honest and trust-based partnerships with external colleagues and peers, among a highly diverse group of stakeholders, from top policymakers through to communities and grassroots activists. And we work with our networks to avoid duplication of effort and to develop thoughtful strategies where we can add value. And I think that's, again, another secret to our success. We're campaign-led in terms of prioritising our activities. So we're more into trailblazing rather than jumping on bandwagons on terms of what might be popular at the time in terms of themes. So I think along with the fact that sometimes we are that critical bad cop in the room.
Yeah, someone's got to be that, and it's necessary. It's a necessary role to play, isn't it? Because you can't all be nice.
No.
One final question before I let you get back to your intimidating workload. What challenges do you see ahead for the organisation? I mean, we're just celebrating 40 years now. We're moving into our fifth decade. We've mentioned some of the ways in which the nature of environmental crime has mutated or evolved in the last few years. What major challenges do you see on the future for us?
I would say at a global level, I feel like a major challenge that faces us is ensuring that politicians, corporations are held accountable for the decisions they make and for the resources or lack thereof that are required to address biodiversity loss and climate change, to prevent the next pandemic and restore nature. And I think a challenge is is in holding their feet to the fire on that. And we have a key role in articulating the relationship between species and ecological integrity and our planetary health. So I think those big global challenges face us. At a more localized level, we can see how that challenge plays out. When we don't see resources going to the right places, with increasing incidences of human and wildlife conflict, and in some cases with tigers. And that would be a failing by all of us who are involved in tiger conservation to plan for tiger conservation success. And so where tigers and other big cats are returning, we're seeing a lot of conflict. So a real challenge for our future is in supporting and contributing to coexistence, and that requires a lot of patient listening to those who live with big cats, and ensuring that the resources are available to help towards coexistence. I would say
nuance.
Yeah, these are the big challenges. If we, for a future planet, those are the big challenges. I guess if you were to look at things more at an organizational level, then I would, the NGO landscape has changed, and there are many more organizations out there investigating environmental crime and feeding information to law enforcement. So it's always important for us to take time to evaluate where we fit in and how to make sure that we continue to be relevant. And I think our partnerships with people on the ground are quite key to that.
Excellent stuff. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's been a while since we've been able to get you on, so I'm delighted and hope we can get you back a lot sooner next time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes, and do check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks for joining us, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.